The scent of boiling sap still lingered in the air the morning the Maple Hill Sugarworks closed its doors for the last time. It was March 27, 1994, the tail end of sugaring season in Northfield, Vermont, population 3,912, where the first thaw of spring meant muddy roads, swollen creeks, and long nights tending evaporators. The factory had been running on fumes for years, its machinery outdated, its payroll perpetually late, its workers clinging to the kind of loyalty born more from habit than hope. Among them was 29-year-old factory hand Caleb Dorsey, a quiet man known for his punctuality, his gentle manner, and the small spiral notebook he always carried in his jacket pocket. On that final Sunday shift, 12 workers reported for duty. By midnight, 11 went home. Caleb did not. His pickup truck remained in the same parking spot, keys dangling from the ignition, engine cold. His lunchbox still sat on the break room table, half a sandwich inside. His timecard was stamped at 11:48 p.m. "We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel." The last recorded moment anyone could prove he'd been alive. The Maple Mill disappearance, as local newspapers would later call it, began as a simple missing person report. But within a week, it had become something darker, an unsolved riddle of locked doors, conflicting testimonies, and a trail of maple syrup that led nowhere. Northfield was the kind of town that didn't ask too many questions unless it absolutely had to. It had one grocery store, 2 bars, 3 churches, and a single shared understanding that hard work and silence could fix almost anything. When Caleb vanished, silence was the first instinct. The factory foreman, Harold Pike, called the disappearance a misunderstanding. Maybe Caleb had gone home late and forgotten to clock out. Maybe he'd taken a long walk after his shift, as some workers did to clear the smell of sugar smoke from their clothes. It wasn't until the following afternoon, when Caleb's sister, Nora Dorsey, drove by his trailer outside of town and found the lights off, the dishes still soaking in the sink, and the radio playing static, that someone finally called the sheriff. Sheriff Miles Corcoran had been in office since 1978. He'd seen suicides, hunting accidents, and the occasional domestic gone bad. But missing adults, those were different. Adults had the right to vanish, and Vermont law didn't consider a disappearance suspicious until there was blood or foul play. Corcoran arrived at the factory around 3:20 p.m. on March 28. The building looked like every Maple Works from the outside, corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, a tall chimney belching the ghost smell of burned sugar, and a sign so faded it read Maple High Sugar. Inside, the air was heavy, the sweetness turning sour in the stillness. Workers stood in small clusters, speaking in low tones. Corcoran walked through the plant, his boots crunching over crystallized syrup flakes, noting details the way only small-town sheriffs do. Caleb's locker was untouched. His work gloves hung neatly on the hook. His spiral notebook, however, was missing. The foreman couldn't explain it, nor could any of the crew. Caleb had been on VAT duty that night, responsible for maintaining heat levels in the large stainless steel evaporators. According to the shift logs, the system had functioned normally until 11:49 p.m., when one of the temperature gauges spiked suddenly before cutting out altogether. No one could say why. The foreman claimed the old wiring sometimes shorted during humidity shifts. But when the sheriff followed the line of power cables to the far wall, he found a small pool of dark liquid beneath the control panel. At first, he thought it was syrup. Then he realized it was too thin. The lab results, processed 3 days later at the state police facility in Bar, confirmed it was blood, human blood, typo positive, consistent with Caleb Dorsey's medical records from a 1991 workplace injury. The quantity, roughly 3 ounces, was not enough to suggest death, but enough to indicate harm. Nora Dorsey refused to believe her brother had run away. She described Caleb as predictable to the point of dullness, a man who still set his alarm for the same time every morning even on days off, who never spent more than $20 without writing it in his notebook, who took their late father's pickup to the same mechanic every 6 months on the dot. She spent the first 48 hours after his disappearance calling hospitals, jails, and halfway houses across New England. When no one had seen him, she began posting flyers on telephone poles and church bulletin boards, using a photograph from their cousin's wedding, a grainy image of Caleb smiling shyly, the only time anyone remembered him in a suit. The investigation quickly ran into obstacles. Maple Hill Sugarworks was shutting down permanently that week, its assets being sold for scrap. Ownership fell under a complicated web of LLCs based out of Montpelier, and the new owners weren't interested in delaying demolition for a missing employee. By April 3rd, the factory gates were padlocked, and the machinery was scheduled for auction. Sheriff Corcoran filed an emergency injunction to preserve the site as potential evidence, but the county judge denied it, citing lack of probable cause. That decision would haunt the town for decades. When the building was dismantled, workers discovered something strange behind the main evaporator, a rectangular void in the wall, roughly the size of a crawlspace. Inside, they found discarded gloves, an old thermos, and a small piece of torn cloth soaked in syrup and something darker beneath. The sheriff ordered the items bagged, but before further examination could be conducted, heavy rain flooded the site, washing away what might have been the last trace of Caleb Dorsey. Rumors filled the vacuum where answers should have been. Some said Caleb had stolen from the cash safe and fled north to Canada. Others whispered that he'd been having an affair with the owner's wife and paid for it. A few believed he'd simply wandered into the forest during the thaw and drowned in the swollen Dog River. But there was another theory, one whispered mostly by the older workers, that the Maple Hill plant had secrets buried deeper than its sap lines. During the 1970s, before Caleb ever worked there, the factory had suffered a fatal accident, a boilover that scalded 2 workers to death when a pressure valve failed. The official report blamed faulty maintenance, but locals claimed the machinery had been deliberately tampered with to cover up illegal waste disposal. The company's founder, a man named Wallace Trumbull, had been under investigation for environmental violations before disappearing himself in 1980. His body was never found, only his car, submerged in a flooded quarry 10 miles outside town. By the second week of April 1994, Sheriff Corcoran's investigation stalled. The state police sent a single detective, Thomas Riggs, to assist, but Riggs spent most of his time chasing dead-end tips. A hunter reported finding a boot near the ridgeline north of town, but it turned out to belong to a teenager who'd lost it sledding the previous winter. A waitress in Montpelier claimed she'd served a man matching Caleb's description, but the surveillance footage was grainy and inconclusive. When spring turned to summer, the case quietly shifted from active to pending. Nora refused to let it go. She quit her job at the post office and began her own search, combing through factory blueprints, interviewing former employees, and writing letters to anyone she thought might listen. Her persistence earned her a reputation as the Maple Mill Sister, a phrase spoken with equal parts admiration and pity. She attended select board meetings with binders full of photocopied documents, trying to convince officials that something more sinister had happened inside that factory. But small towns have short patience for long grief. By autumn, even friends crossed the street to avoid her. In December, a break came, not from law enforcement, but from a hunter named Bill Knowles. While tracking deer in the woods west of Dog River, he stumbled upon a metal barrel half buried in mud. Inside were fragments of fabric, melted rubber, and a wristwatch with the initial CD etched on the back. The barrel also contained traces of calcium hydroxide, lime, commonly used in sugar refining but also in decomposition. The sheriff called it interesting but inconclusive. The lab confirmed that the material inside the barrel contained organic residues consistent with human tissue, but not enough to extract a definitive DNA profile with 1994 technology. The barrel was logged as evidence and stored in the county archives, where it would gather dust for the next 25 years. The Maple Mill property was sold to a lumber cooperative in 1995, and by the following spring, a new warehouse stood where the old factory had once smoked. Life in Northfield returned to normal, or the kind of normal that forgets on purpose. But every March, when sap buckets clanged against trees and the air filled again with the smell of boiling sugar, people remembered, quietly, briefly, and never for long, the man who'd vanished from the factory floor one muddy night without leaving a single set of footprints behind. Years later, when the truth finally emerged, the name Caleb Dorsey would return to every front page in Vermont. But in 1994, his story was only beginning, buried beneath layers of syrup and silence, waiting for a world with better tools, and stronger stomachs, to uncover what really happened inside the Maple Hill Sugarworks. By the spring of 1995, Northfield had folded the story of Caleb Dorsey into its folklore, an unsettling local myth told in quiet tones at diners and gas stations, sandwiched between gossip about bad weather and property taxes. His sister Nora, however, had turned the myth into her religion. Her kitchen became a command post, its table covered with county maps, stacks of photocopied time cards, and jars of sap samples she'd taken from trees near the old Maple Hill site, searching for anything, chemical traces, residues, that might connect to the factory's mysterious past. She wrote letters to the Burlington Free Press, to the governor, to television shows that featured unsolved mysteries. Most never replied. Those that did offered polite regrets. The story of a missing factory worker from a dying Vermont town was not enough to stir national attention. Nora's persistence eventually drew the notice of Detective Thomas Riggs, the state investigator who'd originally been assigned to the case. Riggs had retired in late 1994 after 22 years with the Vermont State Police, but the Dorsey disappearance lingered in his mind like a splinter that refused to heal. In April 1995, he called Nora from his home in Rutland. He'd been reviewing old case notes and noticed something odd about the factory time logs. According to payroll records, the evaporator system had been manually restarted at 12:03 a.m., 15 minutes after Caleb's last punch-in and nearly 30 minutes after the plant should have been closed. No one had admitted to restarting it, and the circuit switch for the evaporator had been found in the off position when investigators arrived the next day. Riggs's theory was simple: someone had returned to the factory after Caleb disappeared. The problem was proving who. Most of the workers lived within a 5-mile radius of the plant, and several had criminal records ranging from petty theft to DUI. The foreman, Harold Pike, had filed for bankruptcy 3 months before the plant shut down and was rumored to be under investigation for falsifying inventory shipments. Another worker, Charlie Red Keating, had been fired from a previous sugarworks for stealing industrial alcohol. And then there was Lorraine Boone, the night custodian, who was the last confirmed person to have seen Caleb alive. Lorraine told police she'd been cleaning the office bathrooms when Caleb left his station to check the syrup lines. She'd waved to him from the hallway. That was at approximately 11:40 p.m. She claimed she hadn't seen him again. When Riggs re-interviewed her in 1995, her story didn't change, but her demeanor did. She seemed frightened, chain-smoking through the entire conversation, flinching at every noise. At one point, she told him something strange, that during her final cleaning round that night, she'd heard machinery humming after she'd shut everything off. When she went back to check, the lights in the main vat room had been flickering. She hadn't gone inside. Riggs asked why she never mentioned this earlier. She said she had, but that Sheriff Corcoran told her it was probably just the power cutting in and out, and not to make a fuss. When Riggs requested permission to review her original statement, he discovered that several pages were missing from the case file. The sheriff's office blamed a filing error. The deeper Riggs dug, the more inconsistencies he found. Evidence chain logs showed that several items collected from the factory, the torn cloth, the thermos, and a single glove, had never been tested. The barrel found in the woods had been sealed without proper photographic documentation. And the blood sample from beneath the control panel, the only confirmed trace of violence, had been stored improperly and degraded beyond use. By midsummer 1995, Riggs began to suspect that the Maple Mill case had been mishandled, possibly intentionally. He arranged a meeting with Sheriff Corcoran, who greeted him with forced politeness in his cramped office behind the courthouse. Corcoran was a broad man with a weathered face, the kind that could look like sympathy or stone depending on the light. Riggs explained his concerns: missing evidence, incomplete logs, discrepancies in timestamps. Corcoran listened expressionless, before leaning back and saying, "Tom, sometimes the best thing you can do for a town like this is let sleeping dogs lie." That was the end of the meeting. 2 weeks later, Riggs's house was broken into. Nothing was stolen except a cardboard box of case files from his garage. There was no forced entry. Officially, Riggs let it go. Unofficially, he began working with Nora. The retired detective and the grieving sister made an unlikely team. He brought procedural knowledge, she brought raw determination. Together, they reconstructed the timeline of March 27, 1994, minute by minute, cross-referencing interviews, machinery logs, and payroll data. What emerged was a chilling pattern of silence: phone calls unreturned, shifts ending early, a foreman who had spent 2 hours checking coolant valves in a section of the factory no longer operational. Nora grew convinced that Caleb had discovered something that night, something worth killing over. Her theory centered around the company's financial collapse. Maple Hill Sugarworks hadn't been merely insolvent, it had been corrupt. There were rumors of illegal chemical dumping, using the evaporator waste system to dispose of solvents from a nearby plastics plant. The sweet smell that residents sometimes noticed on windy nights wasn't just maple, it was industrial runoff. Caleb's notebook, the one that vanished from his locker, might have contained notes about maintenance anomalies or shipping discrepancies. The missing notebook became Nora's obsession. In 1996, she began tracking down former employees one by one. Most wanted nothing to do with her. But one, a forklift operator named Stan Murphy, agreed to meet. He was living in a boarding house in Randolph, drinking himself through early retirement. He told Nora that during the final week of operations, Caleb had confided in him about strange barrels being offloaded behind the mill at night, barrels that didn't smell like syrup. He said Caleb had planned to confront the foreman about it after the final shift. When the sheriff's office had questioned him, Murphy claimed he'd mentioned the barrels, but that detail had never made it into his statement. Murphy died 6 months later of liver failure. His death certificate listed natural causes. By 1997, the case file was officially labeled inactive. Nora's appeals to the state police were ignored. Detective Riggs, disillusioned, stopped returning her calls. But the story wouldn't stay buried. Each spring, local reporters recycled it for the anniversary of disappearance segment, human interest filler between mud season and tourist season. And each time, Nora's phone rang with new tips, most of them worthless. Still, she answered every call, kept every note, built a paper mountain of possibilities in her trailer's spare room. In 1998, a construction crew clearing land near the old Maple Hill site unearthed a concrete slab with a rusted door embedded in it. Beneath the slab lay a narrow chamber about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, an old storage recess used for piping. Inside were shards of glass, a boot heel, and 2 metallic tags bearing serial numbers for machinery maintenance. Nora begged the sheriff to reopen the investigation. Corcoran refused, saying the chamber had been documented during the demolition. But when she filed a public records request for those documents, none existed. It wasn't until 2003, nearly a decade after Caleb's disappearance, that technology began to catch up with the mystery. DNA profiling had advanced, and state police began retesting old evidence. Among the hundreds of dormant samples awaiting reanalysis was the material from the barrel found in the woods, the one containing fragments of fabric and lime residue. The lab report came back in November 2003. The mitochondrial DNA matched the Dorsey family line. Statistically, it was 99.6% likely that the organic material had belonged to a direct maternal relative of Nora Dorsey. The sheriff's office issued a terse statement. Recent forensic testing suggests the remains found in 1994 may be connected to the Dorsey missing persons case. Further analysis pending. No arrests were made. No suspects named. For Nora, it was vindication mixed with horror. Her brother was dead, but finally, someone believed her. Then something stranger happened. A week after the announcement, an anonymous envelope arrived at Nora's mailbox. Inside was a photocopy of a page from Caleb's missing notebook. The paper was smudged, the handwriting unmistakably his. It listed equipment maintenance logs from March 26 and 27, 1994, temperatures, valve checks, syrup levels. But at the bottom of the page was a single cryptic line, Room 7, don't tell Pike. The Maple Hill plant had only 6 numbered processing rooms. Nora brought the page to the sheriff, who dismissed it as a hoax. She sent it to the state lab for fingerprint analysis. Results were inconclusive. But when she visited the county assessor's office to review original building blueprints, she found something that shouldn't have existed, a sublevel beneath the main evaporator floor, labeled Room 7, Storage/Ventilation. It had been sealed off during renovations in 1982, after the fatal accident that killed 2 workers. No one in town claimed to know what had been stored there. The space didn't appear in any of the company's later records. Nora began to believe that whatever happened to Caleb had happened inside that hidden room. The problem was proving it. The warehouse that now occupied the site belonged to a private lumber cooperative that refused her access. She trespassed twice, each time escorted off the property by security. On the 3rd attempt, she was arrested for unlawful entry and fined $250. After that, she stopped. Or appeared to. In truth, she didn't stop. She hired a local surveyor under false pretenses to conduct a soil moisture assessment near the property line. The report, dated May 2004, noted unusual metallic interference detected beneath the northwest corner of the warehouse, roughly where Room 7 would have been located. The interference pattern was consistent with a hollow space or buried metal structure. The data confirmed what Nora already suspected. The past wasn't buried deep enough. In 2005, a new sheriff took office, Ben Hathaway, a younger man with political ambitions and little patience for unsolved legends. He dismissed the Dorsey case as a ghost story that got out of hand. When Nora confronted him at a town meeting, he told her to let the dead rest. But the dead didn't rest. They waited. In 2019, 25 years after Caleb Dorsey vanished, an early thaw and heavy rains caused partial flooding under the old warehouse. When contractors arrived to inspect structural damage, one of them noticed a rusted grate beneath a warped floor panel. The grate led to a sealed hatch. Behind it lay a small concrete chamber, its walls streaked with dark residue, its floor covered in what looked like crystallized syrup. In the corner was a corroded metal tag stamped with 3 letters, CD. The discovery beneath the Maple Hill warehouse should have been routine, an old drainage vault or forgotten equipment room. Instead, it tore open a wound the town had spent 25 years trying to pretend had healed. The contractor who found the hatch, a 31-year-old named Jeff Powers, had no idea what he was looking at when he pried it open. The smell hit him first, a sickly sweet odor of rot and sugar, a combination so wrong it made his stomach turn. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, glinting off crystallized syrup coating the walls like amber ice. In one corner lay what appeared to be the rusted outline of a barrel lid. Beside it, the metal tag with CD. Powers called his supervisor. His supervisor called the sheriff. By the time law enforcement arrived, half the town already knew. Sheriff Ben Hathaway had built his political career on efficiency, not sentimentality. He'd been 12 years old when Caleb Dorsey disappeared, and he'd grown up hearing his parents dismiss the story as old gossip. Now, standing in the dim basement of a warehouse built over the ghost of that rumor, Hathaway realized the past had claws. He ordered the area sealed, evidence techs called in, and the media kept out for now. State investigators arrived from Montpelier the next morning. The crime scene unit used ground-penetrating radar to map the cavity beneath the warehouse. It wasn't a simple chamber, it extended deeper, forming a narrow corridor that turned sharply under what had once been the main evaporator room. The radar images showed irregular voids, possible storage alcoves, filled with sediment and metallic debris. The decision to excavate came quickly, though the process would take weeks. Engineers shored up the warehouse foundation, while forensic teams began clearing the space inch by inch. Within the first 12 hours, they uncovered something unmistakable, a fragment of bone. The remains were fragile, coated in syrup residue and lime dust. Over the next 3 days, additional fragments surfaced, rib pieces, sections of a femur, several teeth. The coroner's preliminary assessment suggested the bones had been exposed to high heat, possibly chemical corrosion. The crystallized syrup had preserved microscopic tissue, allowing for DNA extraction far beyond what 1994's technology could have achieved. When the results came back from the state lab 2 weeks later, they left no doubt. The remains belonged to Caleb Dorsey. The news hit Northfield like a delayed explosion. Local papers ran headlines in heavy black type, "Missing workers' remains found under old factory." Regional television crews swarmed the town. For days, reporters clogged Main Street, asking aging residents what they remembered about that March night in 1994. Most said little. A few muttered that they'd always known something wasn't right. Others refused to talk entirely. Nora Dorsey received the call from a state trooper at 6:14 p.m. She didn't speak for nearly a minute, then asked if he was sure. When he repeated the DNA confirmation, she whispered, "Then find who put him there," and hung up. The autopsy revealed chilling details. Caleb's remains showed no bullet wounds or knife marks. Instead, several ribs displayed microfractures consistent with blunt force trauma. The skull, though incomplete, bore a hairline crack across the parietal bone, likely caused by a single heavy blow. There were traces of industrial solvent on his clothing fibers, matching chemicals once used in sugar refining. Most disturbingly, his larynx showed signs of damage consistent with asphyxiation prior to death. The coroner ruled the manner of death homicide. Sheriff Hathaway, facing mounting pressure, reopened the case officially. The Vermont Bureau of Investigation assigned a cold case specialist, Detective Laura Finch, a quiet, methodical woman known for breaking long unsolved murders through pattern reconstruction. Finch was 43, pragmatic, and uninterested in local politics. She'd read every file from 1994, every report, every contradictory statement. Within a week, She'd noticed the same anomalies that had haunted retired detective rigs decades earlier: the missing notebook, the falsified time logs, and most tellingly, the reference to Room 7. Finch's first visit was to Nora. By then, the woman was 61, her hair white, her health failing but her resolve untouched. Her trailer was a museum of obsession: photographs of Caleb, stacks of binders labeled by year, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Finch spent 3 hours listening as Nora traced every twist of the investigation: the lies, the disappearances, the night she received the photocopied notebook page. When Finch asked to see it, Nora retrieved it from a locked tin box. The detective studied the page under magnification. At first glance, it was exactly as Nora had described. But under UV light, Finch spotted faint indentations, writing impressions from another page once pressed against it. She used a forensic technique called ESDA, electrostatic detection analysis, to recover the hidden text. The words that emerged were chilling: transfer complete. Pike signed off. Room 7 sealed. No record. The signature beneath it read H. Pike. Harold Pike, the former foreman, was still alive, 72 years old, living in a retirement home in Barr. Finch requested an interview. Pike agreed. He was frail, oxygen tubing looped over his ears, his hands trembling as he held his coffee. But his mind remained sharp. When Finch showed him the recovered imprint, his face went pale. "I never wrote that," he said quietly. "But I know what it means." According to Pike, Room 7 had been part of an experimental filtration system built in 1982, designed to reclaim waste syrup runoff. The project had been overseen by the factory's founder, Wallace Trumbull, who died, or disappeared, shortly after. "They told us it was shut down because of contamination," Pike said. "But there were shipments after that. Barrels labeled cleaning solution that came in at night." Caleb asked too many questions. Finch pressed him for details. Pike hesitated, then leaned closer. "Those barrels didn't come from the plastics plant," he whispered. "They came from the state lab in Montpelier." The revelation cracked the case open again, but in a direction no one expected. Vermont's Department of Public Health had, during the 1980s, contracted with private facilities to dispose of experimental chemical waste, residues from medical sterilization and pesticide testing. Officially, all materials were destroyed according to EPA guidelines. Unofficially, smaller companies cut costs by rerouting disposal through unregulated channels. If Maple Hill Sugarworks had accepted those materials under the table, it meant the factory had been part of an illegal waste network, and Caleb Dorsey may have uncovered it. Detective Finch pulled freight logs from the state archives. Sure enough, between February and March 1994, Maple Hill received 6 undocumented deliveries from a Montpelier address tied to a defunct company called Green Chem Solutions. The owner of that company, Leonard K. Dodd, had fled Vermont in 1995 after being indicted for environmental violations. His current whereabouts were unknown. The link between Dodd and the Maple Hill factory was the first tangible lead in decades. Finch tracked down former Green Chem employees. Most were dead, retired, or unwilling to talk. But one, an accountant named Sheila Rayner, now living in Maine, agreed to meet. Her memory was patchy, but she recalled a subcontractor named Pike arranging after-hours transfers of barrels labeled denatured sap. When Finch showed her photos of the factory's excavation, she covered her mouth. "We thought those barrels were burned," she said. "They told us everything was neutralized." Finch returned to Northfield convinced that Caleb had stumbled upon those illegal transfers, perhaps documenting them in his notebook. Someone, possibly Pike, possibly another worker, had confronted him. The altercation turned violent. Caleb was killed, and his body hidden in the sealed sublevel before the factory shut down. The motive was simple: silence. But one detail didn't fit. Pike's health records showed he'd been hospitalized the night of March 27, 1994, after collapsing from chest pains at 9:30 p.m., hours before Caleb vanished. He couldn't have been at the factory. Someone else had signed his name. Finch reviewed employee rosters again. The signature on the hidden imprint, H. Pike, was crude, the P angular, the K looping backward. When she compared it to the real Pike's handwriting from personnel files, it didn't match. But it did match another employee's signature from 1994, Lorraine Boone, the night custodian. Boone had died in 2002, but her son still lived in town. He told Finch that his mother had been haunted for years, plagued by nightmares about the man in the vat. She'd never explained. The night before she died, she burned a shoebox full of old papers in the backyard, staring into the flames until the neighbors called the fire department. When firefighters arrived, she told them she was sending something back to the dirt where it belonged. Finch requested the incident report from 2002. Inside was a list of items the firefighters had salvaged from a partially burned shoebox, among them, a small brass key labeled R7. It matched the lock recovered from the sublevel. That night, Detective Finch drove alone to the warehouse site. Rain hammered the metal siding as she stood over the excavation pit, staring down at the darkness below. Somewhere under that concrete, a woman named Lorraine Boone had sealed a room, signed a dead man's name, and lived the rest of her life pretending it never happened. But the deeper Finch looked into the shadows of 1994, the more she realized the story wasn't just about one man's murder. It was about what the town, and the state, had buried with him. The Maple Mill Sugarworks had been a cover, a convenient facade for something far more dangerous. Caleb Dorsey hadn't just discovered a crime. He had discovered an entire system built on silence, one that didn't stop in Northfield. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired maintenance technician from the state lab in Montpelier, who contacted Finch after seeing the news coverage. He said the name Green Chem Solutions was familiar. In 1993, his supervisor had instructed him to deliver sealed barrels to a private processing facility up north for off-site disposal. He didn't know what was inside, but the barrels bore radiation hazard symbols that had been hastily spray-painted over. When Finch asked if he remembered the driver who signed for them, the technician hesitated, then pulled an old clipboard from his attic. The signature at the bottom of the delivery slip read C. Dorsey. It wasn't Caleb's. It had been forged. And above the forged name, faint but legible, was a second signature, the witness line, signed by Miles Corcoran, the sheriff of Grayson County, Vermont, retired since 2001. The same man who'd told Riggs, "Sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie." The revelation that retired Sheriff Miles Corcoran's signature appeared on a falsified state delivery slip detonated through Vermont law enforcement like a buried landmine finally stepping into daylight. The document, authenticated by the State Forensic Bureau, dated March 24, 1994, 3 days before Caleb Dorsey's disappearance, listed hazardous disposal shipment authorization from Green Chem Solutions to Maple Hill Sugarworks. Under receiving supervisor, the name C. Dorsey had been forged in crude block letters. The witness signature line, written in the practiced cursive of law enforcement paperwork, read M. Corcoran. Detective Laura Finch had seen cover-ups before, misfiled evidence, procedural shortcuts, even quiet favors between departments, but this was different. This was a sitting sheriff inserting himself into an unregulated waste transfer that directly connected to a man's disappearance and eventual murder. She requested Corcoran's retirement records, noting that his pension had been accelerated and sealed under medical privacy in 2001. The current sheriff, Ben Hathaway, was less than enthusiastic about digging into his predecessor's affairs. Miles gave 30 years to this county, he said. Whatever he did it for the town. You start kicking that hornet's nest, you'll wish you hadn't. Finch didn't listen. She drove 2 hours south to Windsor County, where Corcoran lived in a small farmhouse surrounded by maple groves that hadn't been tapped in years. The old sheriff answered her knock himself. He was 81, gaunt but upright, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. When she showed him the document, his reaction was immediate and visceral. His jaw locked, his hand trembled slightly, and for a moment, he looked almost relieved. "Where'd you find that?" he asked. "In a delivery log from the Montpelier lab," Finch replied. "Your name's on it. You witnessed a shipment signed by a forged employee signature. I need to know why." Corcoran sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "I told them not to keep records," he muttered. "Christ. I told them that paper would come back." When Finch pressed him, the dam finally broke. According to Corcoran, the Maple Hill plant had been part of a quiet arrangement between the state and a network of small manufacturers willing to dispose of surplus or misclassified industrial waste, chemical solvents, sterilization agents, trace biohazards. The practice dated back to the early 1980s, when Vermont's environmental disposal costs skyrocketed and budget-conscious officials sought cheaper alternatives. Maple Hill, with its industrial boilers and syrup evaporation systems, offered a perfect facade. "It wasn't my idea," Corcoran said, his voice hollow. "I was told to keep an eye on things. Make sure nobody asked questions." "Who told you?" Finch asked. He hesitated. "A man named Dodd. Green Chem. He said it was state-approved." "And Caleb Dorsey?" Corcoran's eyes lifted, weary but unwavering. He wasn't supposed to see it. He saw the barrels come in that night. He started asking Pike the wrong questions. "When I got the call, they told me he'd had an accident. By the time I got there, the room was sealed." Finch's pen froze over her notebook. "Who called you?" Corcoran exhaled slowly, as if the truth had waited a quarter-century to breathe. "Leonard Dodd." The retired sheriff claimed that Dodd had phoned him around midnight on March 27th, saying there'd been a spill at the factory. When Corcoran arrived, he found the foreman unconscious from smoke inhalation, a handful of workers outside, and Dodd inside the vat room, wearing a respirator. "He told me to go home," Corcoran said. "Said it was handled. I didn't see Caleb, but I saw something burning in the evaporator, something too heavy to be sugar." Finch recorded the entire confession, knowing the implications were enormous. If true, it meant Caleb Dorsey's death wasn't an isolated act of violence but collateral damage from a statewide cover-up. Yet Corcoran refused to sign a statement. "They'll deny it," he said. "They always do. And Dodd's still out there." When Finch returned to Montpelier, she found that Leonard K. Dodd's paper trail had been deliberately erased. His company, Green Chem Solutions, had dissolved in 1995 under bankruptcy protection. His home foreclosed, his tax records sealed under a pending federal inquiry that had mysteriously gone nowhere. The last documented sighting of Dodd was in 1997, passport control in Montreal. After that, nothing. Finch broadened her search to include associates and subcontractors. One stood out, Ethan Callahan, a truck driver who'd worked for Green Chem during the early 90s. Callahan had served a brief sentence in 2009 for illegal dumping in New Hampshire and now lived in a halfway house outside Burlington. When interviewed, he initially denied knowing anything about Maple Hill. But when shown a photograph of Caleb Dorsey, he flinched. "Yeah," he said softly. "I remember him. Nice kid. Shouldn't have been there." Callahan explained that on the night of March 27, 1994, he'd driven one of two Green Chem trucks to Northfield, hauling barrels labeled as sugar wash. He'd been told to unload them into the lower bay room 7. "It wasn't sugar wash," he admitted. "You could smell it through the seals. Sharp, like bleach and gasoline mixed." Dodd had been on-site supervising. Caleb was there too, arguing with Pike about unauthorized delivery. Callahan heard shouting, then a crash. "After that," he said, "Dodd told me to get back in the truck. When I came back 20 minutes later, they were sealing the room." Finch asked if he knew what happened to Caleb. Callahan looked down. "I think he was still in there when they poured the neutralizer." The neutralizer, an industrial lime solution used to stabilize chemical waste, would have effectively dissolved organic matter. The residue found in the barrel and the crystallized syrup walls suddenly made horrifying sense. Callahan's testimony transformed the investigation into a homicide conspiracy. But Finch had a problem: no living witnesses other than Corcoran and a convicted felon, both unreliable in court. The state attorney's office was hesitant to reopen prosecution without physical proof linking Dodd, or anyone, to Caleb's death. "The jury won't convict a ghost," one prosecutor told her. Finch wasn't ready to let it go. She returned to the excavation site for one final sweep before it was resealed. Among the debris catalogued during the dig was a set of corroded identification tags fused together by crystallized sugar. Cleaning them under magnification revealed stamped letters, LKD, Leonard K. Dodd. It was the first physical evidence tying Dodd to the site. Finch's report to the Attorney General's office was exhaustive, 186 pages detailing the waste scheme, forged signatures, falsified shipping manifests, and new DNA evidence. She closed with a recommendation that the Dorsey case be reclassified as industrial homicide with state complicity. It was a bureaucratic term for murder by negligence and corruption. The AG's office stalled. 4 months, nothing happened. Then, in early 2020, a retired U.S. Customs agent contacted Finch after reading about the case. He'd worked border control at Montreal in 1997 and remembered Leonard Dodd distinctly, traveling under a fake passport, headed to British Columbia. Dodd had claimed to be visiting a maple extraction facility. The agent provided a copy of the old manifest. The company listed as Dodd's destination was Cascade Biological Reclamation, Limited, a shell corporation dissolved in 2001. Finch followed the trail west, submitting a request through Interpol. Canadian authorities confirmed that a man using Dodd's alias, Lyle Denham, had lived in Kamloops, British Columbia, until 2015, working maintenance at a water treatment plant. He died in 2017 of heart failure. His estate contained no identification, but fingerprints retrieved from his medical file matched Leonard K. Dodd's Vermont DMV records. The ghost had a body after all. When Finch received the confirmation, she drove back to Northfield to deliver the news to Nora Dorsey. She found the old woman sitting on her porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, the March wind carrying the faint scent of thawing sap. Finch explained everything: the shipments, the forgery, the cover-up, the death of the man responsible. Nora listened silently, her eyes on the sugar maples lining the road. "So he's dead," Nora said at last. "No trial. No apology." "I'm sorry," Finch said. "I wanted justice." Nora's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Justice doesn't live here anymore, detective. It left the same night my brother did." She died 6 months later, her heart finally surrendering after 25 years of rage and winter. After her funeral, Finch was clearing out Nora's trailer when she found something taped beneath the kitchen drawer: Caleb's missing notebook, its cover warped but intact. Inside were pages of meticulous handwriting, maintenance schedules, chemical readings, sketches of the factory layout. The final page, dated March 27, 1994, ended with a line that stopped Finch cold: "If anything happens, tell Nora about the barrels. Tell her they're not what they say they are." Finch stared at the words until they blurred. After decades of silence, Caleb Dorsey had spoken at last. She turned the notebook over in her hands and noticed faint burn marks along the spine, scorching from lime or solvent. Someone had tried to destroy it and failed. In her official report, Finch listed the notebook as recovered evidence and recommended it be archived with the Vermont Cold Case Division. But privately, she kept it in her desk drawer, reading and rereading it on nights when sleep refused to come. The Maple Hill story should have ended there, with bones identified, culprits named, and ghosts laid to rest. But 2 years later, in 2022, a graduate researcher at the University of Vermont uncovered something new while digitizing the state's environmental archives. A series of microfilm reels contained internal memos from 1993, stamped confidential, Department of Public Health. One memo, dated March 22, 1994, 5 days before Caleb vanished, authorized temporary storage and neutralization testing at Maple Hill Sugarworks for an experimental biocide codenamed Project Sable. The memo bore 3 signatures: L.K., Dodd, W., Trumbull, and M. Corcoran. Trumbull had supposedly died in 1980. Finch rechecked the signature against historical records. It matched perfectly. That meant Vermont's most notorious missing industrialist, the founder of Maple Hill Sugarworks, had never died in 1980. He'd simply changed names, shifted roles, and continued his experiments under government contracts long after his death. And now, every assumption about the Maple Mill case, the motive, the killer, even the purpose of those barrels, was appended. Caleb Dorsey hadn't stumbled onto simple corruption. He'd uncovered a program that wasn't supposed to exist, one that extended far beyond maple syrup, barrels, or even Vermont. Detective Finch realized that the story she thought she'd solved had only just begun. The memo changed everything. For 28 years, every investigator, journalist, and grieving relative had believed the Maple Hill case was a story of greed, negligence, and silence. But Project Sable introduced an entirely new dimension, a secret that stretched beyond small-town corruption into the cold machinery of state experimentation. Detective Laura Finch printed the memo 3 times, half expecting the letters to fade like a mirage. The signature of Wallace Trumbull, the supposedly dead founder of Maple Hill Sugarworks, gleamed under the copier's light. The loops of his handwriting matched perfectly with old company checks from the late 1970s. Either someone had forged it with master precision, or Trumbull hadn't died at all. The deeper Finch dug, the stranger the trail became. Project Sable didn't exist in any public database. There were no budget appropriations, no environmental permits, no oversight committee minutes. But the document header, Department of Public Health, Biohazard Containment Pilot, was genuine. The watermark matched 1990s-era state stationery. And one paragraph, redacted in black marker, contained 3 words faintly visible under infrared scan: pathogen neutralization trial. She brought the findings to the Vermont Bureau of Investigation. They told her to drop it. Old paper, no chain of custody, no relevance to a homicide, her superior said. Finch countered that the memo directly linked to Caleb Dorsey's death. The barrels, the sealed room 7, the presence of chemical waste, all pointed to something more than industrial byproduct. This isn't waste, she said. It's research material. They weren't hiding pollution, they were hiding a program. Her boss leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. You're chasing ghosts, Laura. There's no Project Sable. There never was. But Finch had seen enough to know when someone was afraid. She spent the next month tracing the names on the memo. Leonard K. Dodd was confirmed dead in 2017. Sheriff Corcoran had died quietly in his sleep weeks after his confession. That left only one name: Wallace Trumbull. Official records listed him as deceased, drowned in 1980, body never recovered. The death certificate was signed by a county coroner who later lost his license for falsifying autopsies. Finch drove to the archives in Montpelier and requested Trumbull's probate file. The envelope was empty. She checked federal records next. There she found something that shouldn't have existed: a passport issued in 1983 under the name William T. Rumble, bearing a photograph of a man identical to Trumbull 20 years younger. The alias had been flagged by customs in 1991 for irregular travel to Quebec and Alberta, regions known for bioengineering research partnerships. His last recorded entry into the United States was April 1994, 3 weeks after Caleb Dorsey vanished. Finch's mind reeled. If Trumbull was alive under an alias, then the Maple Hill Sugarworks might have been more than just a disposal site. It might have been a live testing ground for whatever Project Sable was. And Caleb, meticulous, curious Caleb, had found something he was never meant to see. She returned once more to Caleb's recovered notebook, combing through every line with forensic precision. Between temperature logs and syrup density readings, she noticed odd annotations written in shorthand: pH unstable after line flush, residue fluoresces under black light, smell, not ethanol, not methanol, something metallic. One phrase repeated several times: vapors from R7 causing dizziness. Room 7 hadn't just been a storage space, it had been active. Finch requested toxicology testing on the crystallized residue found along the sublevel walls. The results stunned her. The compound was a hybrid mixture of calcium oxide, sucrose, and trace biocides consistent with chloropicrin, a chemical warfare agent banned since 1949. The implication was staggering. Someone had been conducting biological neutralization experiments using maple syrup production as cover. The heat of the evaporators would have masked chemical traces in the steam, blending sweet sap scent with something far more dangerous. When Finch presented the results to the Bureau, she was pulled off the case within 48 hours. The official explanation was conflict of jurisdiction. Unofficially, it was a muzzle. Her badge was still valid, but her access to files was revoked. That night, she drove back to Northfield. Rain lashed the roads, the kind of icy downpour that turned everything into reflective ghosts. She parked near the old factory site, now fenced off again after the excavation. Behind the chain-link barrier, the warehouse loomed like a mausoleum. For a moment, she imagined Caleb standing there in 1994, staring at those same walls, notebook in hand, trying to make sense of something too big for a single man to contain. She wasn't alone. A dark SUV sat idling near the access road, its headlights off. When she turned to leave, it followed, half a mile back, steady, silent. She took a detour onto a back road, cut her lights, and waited. The SUV passed slowly, its taillights vanishing into the mist. The next morning, she filed a sealed report under personal custody. If anything happened to her, it would be released automatically to 3 independent journalists. She also sent a copy to the Vermont Historical Society's digital archive under a false accession label, Maple Industry Records 1970 to 2000. A week later, she received an unmarked envelope in her office mailbox. Inside was a single photograph: a man in a hospital bed, oxygen mask covering his face, eyes open and aware. The handwritten note on the back read, "You're not the first to look, and you won't be the last. W.T." The hospital metadata on the back of the photo was faint but legible. St. John Regional, New Brunswick, 2014. Trumbull. He had lived to see his own myth become a shield. Finch requested Canadian medical records under mutual legal assistance, but the files had been purged. The hospital confirmed a patient by that alias, admitted April 2014, discharged to private facility. No forwarding information. In 2023, a Freedom of Information request filed by an independent documentarian yielded a new piece of the puzzle. Among declassified EPA correspondence was an interoffice memo dated May 1994, 1 month after Caleb's disappearance. It referenced a containment breach at Vermont Sector Facility B, and an emergency directive to seal and sterilize all bioreactive units. The signature? W. T. Rumble. The location coordinates placed facility B exactly where Maple Hill Sugarworks once stood. For nearly 30 years, the state had treated the Dorsey case as a tragic accident. Now it looked like a cleanup. Finch's investigation became a race against time. She tracked down one last surviving Green Chem employee, a chemist named Roger Hall, living under assumed identity in upstate New York. He'd fled Vermont in 1995 after seeing too much. When Finch found him, he was frail and dying of lung cancer. He agreed to speak on record. Hall confirmed everything: the barrels, the neutralizer, the sealed room. But he added one detail that froze her blood. It wasn't just chemicals, he said. They were testing organic neutralization, something that reacted to biological tissue. That's why they needed heat. That's why the syrup crystallized. What was in the barrels? Finch asked. He smiled weakly. We called it Sable serum. Designed to render biological agents inert. It worked, mostly. Until it didn't. Your factory boy wasn't supposed to see it, but he did. And when it activated, it didn't care who was watching. Hall coughed blood onto his sleeve. We sealed it because we had to. Dodd said it would burn out in 24 hours. He lied. It stayed alive. Finch didn't understand. Alive. Hall closed his eyes. You ever seen sugar move by itself? He died 2 days later. The coroner ruled natural causes, but Finch couldn't shake his words. The notion that the Maple Hill incident wasn't just murder, but containment, tore at the edges of everything she thought she knew. She re-examined autopsy photos of Caleb's remains. Microscopic crystalline growths lined his ribcage and bone marrow, once dismissed as sugar deposits from a factory environment. But under ultraviolet light, they emitted a faint phosphorescence. Organic sugar structures didn't glow. Something had catalyzed them. Something still unknown. The official investigation closed in 2024, declaring insufficient evidence for further criminal proceedings. Finch resigned shortly after. She moved to a cabin near Montpelier and stopped talking to reporters. But locals still saw her sometimes, walking the forest edge with a flashlight, testing soil with small glass vials, collecting samples of maple sap that shimmered faintly under moonlight. In spring 2025, a young forestry student hiking near the old Maple Hill site stumbled across a collapsed drainage pipe. Inside was a film of thick amber syrup that pulsed when disturbed, like something breathing under glass. The student photographed it, posted the image online. 2 days later, the post vanished, and his account was deleted. By then, Northfield had learned not to ask questions. The factory land was bought by a private agricultural trust under federal contract. Signs went up reading Restricted Soil Study Area, NO entry. Locals joked that the ground was haunted. They said the trees closest to the site produced sap darker than blood, syrup that wouldn't boil clear no matter how hot the fire. They said if you listened at night, you could still hear dripping beneath the soil, like something slowly trying to climb back to the surface. Detective Finch never confirmed or denied those stories. She kept to herself, her windows covered, her mailbox overflowing with unanswered letters from journalists. But her personal notes, found years later, revealed one final entry, written in her own precise handwriting. Caleb saw the truth. They sealed it under sugar and lies. But it's still here. Still moving. The Maple Mill disappearance had begun as a tale of one man's vanishing. Now it had become something else entirely, a warning buried beneath Vermont's sweetest export, waiting for the next thaw to wake it. When spring returned to Northfield in 2026, the thaw came early. The snow melted in thick, heavy slabs that slid from rooftops like skin shedding from bone. The air tasted faintly metallic, sweet but wrong, as if the earth itself had spoiled beneath the frost. Locals said the maples were bleeding too soon. The sap ran dark, clotted, reluctant to clear even after hours of boiling. To most, it was a nuisance of a bad season. To the few who remembered the Maple Hill case, it was an omen. By then, the factory site was sealed under heavy fencing and monitored by motion-triggered cameras. The soil research explanation satisfied the newspapers, but residents who lived near the ridge began reporting things they couldn't name. The ground steamed in places where no snow should have melted. Dogs refused to walk the perimeter. Birds avoided the trees altogether. At night, a faint hum drifted from the direction of the old sublevel, rhythmic and low, like distant machinery or breath. Detective Laura Finch had officially retired, but her obsession hadn't. Her house near Montpelier had become a makeshift laboratory, a single room filled with notebooks, sample jars, and microscopes borrowed from a university under aliases. She had continued collecting specimens from the region's maple groves. The most recent ones, taken from trees half a mile from the old factory, showed crystalline formations suspended within the sap itself. Under magnification, the formations appeared almost cellular, with branching filaments resembling mycelium rather than sugar. More disturbingly, when she introduced a drop of distilled water to a dried sample, the structures twitched. She recorded the observation in her final field log, March 9, 2026, sample 44B, reactive to moisture. Activity persists for 13 seconds. No known biological analog. Movement suggests organized response. Finch sent the sample to a private microbiology lab in Montreal under the label Agricultural Contamination Study. 2 weeks later, the lab's lead technician called her in the middle of the night. "Whatever this is," he said, "it's not bacterial. It's polymeric. Self-assembling. It replicates when exposed to glucose." The line went dead. When she called back, the number was disconnected. The next morning, her mailbox contained an envelope with no return address. Inside was a small glass vial, half filled with thick amber liquid. A note in precise block letters read, "You were right. It was never neutralized. Burn everything." Finch stared at the vial for a long time before sealing it inside a lead-lined sample case. She didn't burn her files. She knew better. She sent duplicates of everything, lab reports, photographs, Caleb Dorsey's notebook scans, to a contact in Boston, an environmental lawyer who had once worked EPA enforcement. The courier service confirmed delivery on March 21. 2 days later, the lawyer's office burned down in what the local fire marshal called an electrical fault. Finch disappeared that same week. Neighbors reported seeing her drive north toward the Canadian border with a single suitcase and her dog. Her car was later found abandoned near Derby Line, doors locked, keys in the ignition. The trunk was empty. No sign of struggle. No footprints leading away, just a thin crust of frost over the ground, unbroken. The state police issued a routine missing person bulletin, but her colleagues knew better. They remembered Caleb Dorsey's footprints ending 15 feet from his door. When investigators searched Finch's home, they found her research meticulously packed into labeled boxes stacked in her basement. But one item was missing, the vial. On her desk lay an open notebook, its final page filled with hurried handwriting. "I found the origin. It wasn't waste. It was growth." Sable wasn't a neutralizer, it was a seed. No signature. The years that followed blurred fact and rumor. In 2027, a series of unexplained illnesses spread through parts of rural Vermont: respiratory distress, fatigue, skin irritation. Environmental tests showed elevated sugar compounds in groundwater, but the Department of Health dismissed them as benign agricultural runoff. Maple syrup yields that season broke state records. The product had an unusually rich color, grade a dark robust, and a faint mineral aftertaste that tourists described as unique. By autumn, truckloads of the syrup were being exported across the Northeast. A viral marketing campaign rebranded it as Sable Gold, Vermont's Deep Reserve. Within months, bottles appeared on boutique grocery shelves from Boston to Chicago. The label featured a stylized maple leaf over a black background, with a single line of text beneath, "Harvested from the heart of the Northfield Ridge." No one knew who owned the company. Its registration traced to a corporate shell in Delaware. But those who'd lived in Northfield long enough recognized the logo. The curling shape of the leaf's veins wasn't natural. It was the same fractal pattern Detective Finch had drawn in her final notebook, the cellular structure that moved when watered. In December 2028, a journalist named Aaron Tully from the Burlington Record began investigating the Sable gold phenomenon. Tully was young, ambitious, and relentless, the kind of reporter who thrived on secrets. Her articles had exposed corrupt zoning boards and fraudulent farm subsidies. When she requested interviews with company representatives, she received polite rejections. When she pushed further, filing FOIA requests about the Maple Hill land deed, her inquiries were quietly rerouted to federal agencies. On January 12, 2029, she drove to Northfield to see the site herself. Her last text to her editor read, "There's movement under the snow. Looks like steam, but it's cold out here. Getting closer." She never returned. Her rental car was found parked at the end of County Road 7, driver's door open, engine still running. The snow around the car had melted in a perfect circle 12 feet wide. Her phone was recovered in the front seat. The last photo showed something that at first appeared to be tree roots spreading across the frozen ground. But under magnification, the roots weren't wood. They were translucent, ribbed, threaded with veins of golden syrup that pulsed faintly like capillaries. The photo was suppressed by the Record's legal department. It never ran. That same winter, local hunters began finding deer carcasses near the ridge, drained, their internal organs crystallized. The official explanation blamed mineral contamination, but the pattern was always the same: amber residue coating the chest cavity, bones glittering faintly in the beam of flashlights. By 2030, the state quietly condemned the area. Roads were rerouted, maps updated. Northfield's population dwindled as younger families moved south. Those who remained rarely mentioned the factory anymore. They said the land was sour. They said the trees whispered when the wind turned warm. And still, every spring, sap rose from the ground that no one dared to collect. Years later, a graduate student from Boston University, cataloging unsolved Vermont cold cases, stumbled upon Finch's sealed evidence file in digital archives mislabeled as Maple Hill Historical Inventory. Among the scans was Caleb Dorsey's original notebook page, the one written hours before his death. The student enhanced the faint indents on the paper's underside, revealing words invisible to the naked eye. They were written in Caleb's meticulous hand, smaller and fainter than the rest. "The air feels thick. Like breathing syrup. The walls are sweating. The sugar's alive." Today, the official record still lists the Maple Mill case as solved. Victim, Caleb Dorsey, 1994. Cause of death, blunt force trauma/chemical exposure. Perpetrator, Leonard K. Dodd. Deceased. Status, closed. But in Northfield, no one believes the case is over. The land where the factory once stood remains fenced, patrolled by private security that refuses to disclose its employer. At night, truck convoys with covered tanks still enter through the North Access Road. Locals swear the air smells faintly of burnt sugar when they pass. Sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, the sound of slow, viscous dripping echoes through the trees, and the sap buckets hanging in old barns rattle against their nails, though no one has touched them in years. If you drive Route 12 north out of town in early spring, you'll see the ridge through the trees. The snow there always melts first, running down the hill in thin amber streams that catch the light like liquid glass. They say it's just mineral runoff. They say the soil's rich. But if you stop your car, step out, and listen, really listen, you might hear a faint heartbeat beneath the ground. Slow. Patient. Waiting. The locals have a new name for that place now. They don't call it the Maple Mill anymore. They call it the Heartwood. End of the Maple Mill Disappearance, 1994 to 2030, a work of fiction, based on the fragility of truth, the persistence of secrets, and the quiet hunger of what we bury. We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel.